This is Larry Jordan, the host of the Digital Production Buzz. The following interview is an excerpt from a recent program. To hear the entire program, visit digitalproductionbuzz.com. Jonathan Handel is an entertainment and technology attorney of Counsel at TroyGould in Los Angeles. He's also a contributing editor on entertainment labor issues for The Hollywood Reporter, and he's got his own blog at jhandel.com. As always, Jonathan, welcome back.
Well, Larry, it's a pleasure to be back. And there's one thing that's not as always, which is this is actually the first time I'm appearing via video on the show.
Isn't it cool? It is. We are having such, and what you got to do is you got to come out to the studio and let us show you all of our toys. We got more blinking lights here than Michael can count. It's really...
Jonathan, are those books behind you?
Those are books.
Have you read every single one of them?
I've written several of them.
You've written several of them. Of course you have.
Show off.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I've got a question. We've got this new SAG-AFTRA contract, the new rate sheet that's out. Not the contract, but the rate sheet for indie films. What does this affect? Who should care about this?
Well, people making films with budgets under, roughly speaking, under $4 million are potentially affected. There are actually several different SAG, or now SAG-AFTRA, low-budget agreements. They have different budget thresholds, and at the different thresholds, different rates apply. But all of the rates have gone up by 25% as of July 1st of this year. And some of the budget thresholds have gone up as well. So pictures that might not have qualified under the older agreements might qualify today.
Well, if the rates have gone up by 25%, who needs to pay attention to this? In other words, I think the key question is, when should a director decide to go SAG-AFTRA, and when should a director decide to go non-union? Is it purely a budget decision?
Well, it's not purely a budget decision, because the reality, of course, is that SAG-AFTRA controls most of the talented and experienced and even moderately experienced acting labor in the country. So, the ability, when someone says non-union versus union, you really have to ask which union are you talking about? Because, of course, a studio picture will tend to be SAG-AFTRA for actors, Writers Guild for the writers, and Directors Guild for the director and assistant directors, and IATSE for the crew. So when someone says I'm making a non-union picture, they usually are making a picture using SAG-AFTRA actors, but they're going non-union with those other silos. So most people making narrative film, making fictional films, whether they're shorts, whether they are ultra low budget, which is a film below the budget now below $250,000, that's the threshold. Modified low budget agreement goes up to $700,000. There are diversity incentives. If your casting is diverse, the budget thresholds are a bit higher. And then finally, at the low budget level, as opposed to the modified or ultra, you're at a $2.5 million budget threshold, or 3.75 if you have diverse casting. So if you're making a movie that's at one of those levels, you're affected by this.
Yeah, we're talking, especially with our audience, a lot of them are dealing with budgets that are under $250,000. And
right.
This is going to affect them big time, because we're talking about, 25% increase here, right? I mean, that's significant.
About a day rate for actors, for example, on the ultra low budget, which is below that $250K,
right,
of $125 a day for actors, rather than the previous $100. Now, SAG-AFTRA would remind us that this is actually the first increase in these rates in 10 years. And of course, this comes against a backdrop of increasing pressure across the country and moves across the country to raise the minimum wage. So, if you were talking $100 a day for, say, an 8 or 10 hour day, you're talking $10 an hour, 12-hour day, that's down to $8 an hour, which is below where people are raising the minimum wage these days. So it really, in fact, keeps up with what's going on in the larger economy.
Does SAG and AFTRA publish the number of ultra low budget films versus the upper tier budget films per year?
I've never seen them publish that. No, and they tend to be very circumspect about releasing market data. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's actually it sparks the idea for for an article actually.
Yeah.
And thank you for that. But whether they would actually supply the data, I don't know.
What does a producer or director need to know to be able to work with SAG talent? What kind of commitment are they looking at? Let's say you're doing a budget of, say, $700,000. So it's not real small, but it's still small. What do they have to do, and what are they committing to?
Well, first of all, $700K is exactly the threshold for the modified low budget agreement. The day rate there is $335 a day. So it's it's definitely a pricier tag than if you're below that $250K. You are talking about needing to make pension and health contributions, I believe. You are talking about being subject to some, though not all, of the union rules regarding things like meal penalties and forced call, the time between when the actor checks out, when they check in the next day, stuff like that, consecutive employment, various technical rules that I can't cite to chapter and verse as to exactly which are included and which aren't under that agreement. But you are committing to a union regiment, and the potential that if you get things wrong, that the union will slap your wrist on that in terms of fines and that kind of thing. You are also, of course, in any union picture, talking about residuals. So these contracts that we've been talking about are contracts that are intended where the goal of the producer is an initial theatrical release of the movie. And there's no residuals for that, of course, but if you then have subsequent releases, online, home, or physical home video, whatever it might be, obviously television, you're going to be talking about residuals. That kind of leads us into a related topic, which is, what is it that you're making your movie for? I think it's important to think about, okay, am I realistically going to shoot for a theatrical release and go with one of these agreements? Or am I going to shoot in today's world for an initial internet release, an initial online release, and use one of the internet agreements, which are very different? The internet agreements have a lot of free bargaining in terms of some of the terms and conditions, some of the rates and so forth. And if someone is going to end up most likely releasing a picture to a streaming service, not getting a theatrical release or getting a token theatrical release, it may be economically more sensible to think about your project as something for internet release. That's something that each producer has to think about very carefully.
Yeah. We have to remind everybody who's very interested in this whole thing is that SAG Indie makes it extremely simple, I think, for filmmakers to get all the resources that they need at sagindy.org, and that's all you need to do. So if you are confused about what we're talking about here, sagindy.org has got everything that you need to know.
Jonathan, we've just had a minute left, and I want to come back to something. There was a lawsuit regarding unpaid interns with Fox that got reversed by the higher court.
Oh, yeah.
What's the summary of this? Because I want to bring you back next week to talk about it in detail. But tell me, like in a thumbnail, what's happened?
In a thumbnail, the lower court said that the way unpaid internships were being done in this industry, in the entertainment, and as well in others, was not permissible, and that interns had to be paid. The appeals court, and as a result, a lot of companies changed their programs and are paying, large companies anyways, Fox and various other studios, and are paying interns. But the appeals court reversed that and said, no, these internships programs were permissible as is. How that's going to play out is going to be a very interesting question.
Well, that's something that deserves its own segment. What I'd like to do is to bring you back next week, and we'll spend some time talking about that in more detail, because interns are everywhere in this industry, and we want to make sure we understand what the court actually allows us to do. So, can you come back?
Absolutely.
And number two, for people that want to keep track of what you're doing between now and then, where can they go on the web to learn more?
jhandel.com, jhandel.com.
And the J Handel himself, Mr. Jonathan Handel. Jonathan, thanks for talking with us. We look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll talk more about this whole intern issue. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Bye,
Take care. Bye-bye.